The groan of the train was a living thing, a beast of iron and steam dying its way across the Arizona territory. It was a sound that worked its way into a person's bones, a constant shudder that promised movement but offered no escape. For Ida Marlin, crouched behind a stack of flour sacks in the freight car, the shudder was the rhythm of her own heart. Each clatter of the wheels on the track was a second stolen, a second closer to a destination she did not know, a second farther from a fate she knew all too well. The air was thick enough to chew. It tasted of hot metal and coal smoke, and underneath it all, the fine red dust that was the very blood of this land. It settled on her tongue like rust, coated the inside of her nostrils, and filmed over her dark dress, turning the respectable black fabric into a map of her panicked journey. Light sliced through the gaps in the wooden slats of the car, sharp and white and unforgiving, painting stripes across the dusty floor and the jumbled cargo. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, drawing the moisture from her skin until her lips felt cracked and ancient. Then she heard it, a sound different from the train's mechanical torment, the scrape of a boot heel on the coupling between cars. Heavy, deliberate. Another scrape followed, closer this time. Then the thud of a man landing on the floor of their car. One man. Then a second, a third. They did not speak, but she could hear the confidence in their movements, the sound of men who were not passengers, who were not paying for their passage with coin. They were hunters. Her breath caught in her throat. A small, trapped thing. She pressed herself tighter against the rough burlap of the sacks, trying to will herself into nothingness. She was Ida Marlin, daughter of a preacher, a girl raised on scripture and quiet obedience, 18 years old and promised. No, not promised. Sold. That was the truer word, the one she whispered to herself in the dark. Sold to settle a debt of her father's own making. A contract signed and sealed with a man whose hands were as cold as his eyes. Corbin Vance, a name that felt like a bruise. Her escape had been a frantic, ill-planned thing. A few coins, a loaf of bread, and a desperate scramble onto this westbound train in the dead of night. She had thought the vast, empty desert would be her sanctuary. She had been a fool. The desert did not hide anyone. It only exposed them. A low chuckle echoed in the cavernous space of the freight car. "She is in here somewhere. Boys," a gravelly voice said. "Smell that like a scared rabbit. Clean. Church clean." Another voice, younger and meaner, chimed in. "Mr. Vance wants her back without a scratch on her. Cletus says she is a delicate thing." "She will be delicate enough when we find her." The first voice, Cletus, replied. The sound of a crate being kicked over punctuated his sentence. It splintered with a sharp crack that made Ida flinch. Shame burned hot in her cheeks, hotter than the Arizona sun. To be spoken of this way, like an animal run to ground, like a piece of property that had wandered off. The terror was a cold knot in her stomach, but the shame was a fire that threatened to consume her. She closed her eyes and prayed, not with the formal words her father had taught her, but with a raw, silent scream of the soul. It was then she became aware of him. She had noticed him when she first slipped into the car, a shape in the corner that she had mistaken for a pile of blankets or another stack of goods. But it was a man. He sat on a low crate, his back against the wall, perfectly still. He had not moved, had not made a sound since she had first seen him. He was a statue carved from shadow and silence. A thick wool coat was draped over his shoulders despite the suffocating heat. A dusty hat was pulled low, obscuring most of his face, but she could see the hard line of a jaw covered in dark stubble. His hands rested on his knees, large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with rope and wood and iron. He seemed utterly oblivious to the heat, to the dust, to the three men searching the car. He was an island of stillness in her sea of panic. Cletus and his companions, Silas and Bart, were working their way closer. They moved with a clumsy certainty, shoving aside barrels and tearing at tarps. They were enjoying this. The hunt was the point. As much as the prize, Ida knew she had only moments. Her hiding place was too obvious. Another prayer died on her lips. Faith felt a long way off. Action was all that was left. Her gaze fixed on the silent man. He was a stranger. He could be worse than the men hunting her. He could be a thief, an outlaw, any manner of godless creature her father had warned her about. But in his stillness, there was something else. Not menace, just presence, an unshakable solidity. He was her only chance, and it was no chance at all. Scrabbling from behind the flour sacks, she moved. She did not run. She crept across the swaying floor on her hands and knees, the rough boards snagging her dress. The dust puffed up around her, and she could hear Silas curse as he saw the movement. There she is. She did not look back. Her eyes were locked on the man in the corner. She reached him and did the only thing she could think to do. The most humiliating act of her young life, she knelt before him, a supplicant before a silent god of dust and shadow. She did not speak. She could not. The words were choked with fear and shame. She simply looked up, her face a mask of desperation, and clasped her hands together in a plea that was older than language. The man did not move for a long second. She felt the hunters closing in behind her, felt the heat of their approach. She could smell the sour scent of whiskey on one of them. This was it, the end. Then, slowly, the man stirred. He did not look at her. His gaze, from under the brim of his hat, was fixed on something over her head, on the approaching men. He shifted his weight, and with one smooth, economical motion, he lifted the edge of his heavy wool coat. He held it open, creating a dark, small cave of fabric. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. It was not an offer. It was a statement of temporary law. "Under my coat," he said, his voice calm and even. "You do not answer to no one." For a heartbeat. Ida froze. The words were a lifeline thrown into a churning abyss. Without a second thought, she scrambled forward. Ducking under the heavy fabric, she curled into a tight ball at his feet, hidden from the world by a curtain of dusty, sweat-stained wool. The coat smelled of leather and horse and wood smoke, a scent so fundamentally male and unfamiliar it made her head spin. But it was a shield. She pulled her knees to her chest and held her breath. Heavy boots stopped just a few feet away. "Well now," Cletus's voice was slick with false friendliness. "What if we hear you mind telling us what you got hiding under that coat, friend?" The man, Jed Holt, did not reply. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ida could feel the tension through the man's boots, a coiled stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. "He is talking to you," Silas snarled. "We are looking for a runaway girl, property of Mr. Corbin Vance of El Paso. There is a reward." Still, Jed said nothing. Ida could picture him, sitting there, his face unreadable, his quietness a wall. "Look," Bart's voice was wheedling, trying a different approach. "We do not want any trouble. Just give us the girl and we will be on our way. Mr. Vance is not a patient man." The silence that answered them was absolute. It was not an empty silence. It was weighted, profound. It was the silence of a mountain that refuses to move, the silence of a deep well that swallows all sound. It was a silence that said more than any words of defiance could. It said, "I am here. You are not. Go away." Ida could hear Cletus shifting his weight from one foot to the other. She heard him clear his throat. The hunter's confidence, so loud and certain just moments before, was evaporating in the face of this man's immense, unshakable calm. They were men used to bluster and violence, to fear and intimidation. They did not know what to do with a man who simply refused to acknowledge their existence. "Forget it, Cletus," Silas muttered, his voice low. "He is not worth the trouble. We will get her when the train stops." "He is one man," Cletus hissed back, but his voice lacked conviction. "One man who looks like he could chew nails and spit rust," Silas retorted. "We will wait. The town is small. She cannot hide forever. There was another moment of charged silence, and then the sound of retreating footsteps. They were gone. The immediate threat had passed, leaving behind a lingering odor of cheap whiskey and menace. Ida remained curled under the coat, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. The space was dark and close, a small, protected world. She listened to the steady rhythm of the train, the clatter and groan that was once the sound of her fear, now becoming a sound of escape once more. She was acutely aware of the man she was hiding behind. She could feel the solid presence of his legs against her side, the sheer physical reality of him. He had not asked her name. He had not asked why she was running. He had simply seen a creature in need of shelter and provided it. He had created a law. Just for her. Just for this moment. Under his coat. She answered to no one. The train began to slow, the rhythm of the wheels changing from a frantic clatter to a long, drawn-out screech of metal. The beast of iron was finally dying. Sunlight, impossibly bright, flooded the car as the large freight door was slid open with a deafening rumble. The air that rushed in was not cooler, but it was different. It smelled of wood smoke from a blacksmith's forge and the dry, dusty scent of a town clinging to life in the heat. The man, Jed, moved. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, the coat settling back over his broad shoulders. He stood for a moment, a tall silhouette against the blinding white doorway. Then he stepped towards the light. He did not look back at her. He did not say a word. He simply began to leave. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Ida. He was leaving her, here, alone. She crawled out from where she had been hiding, her limbs stiff and sore. She blinked against the painful brightness, her eyes watering. He was already at the edge of the car, about to jump down to the dusty platform. She had to make a choice. Stay in the shadows of the train car, where the hunters would surely find her, or follow the silent stranger into the unforgiving light of a town called Santa. He paused on the edge, as if sensing her hesitation. He turned his head slightly, not enough to see his face, just the line of his jaw and the brim of his hat. It was not an invitation, not a command. It was just a pause, an acknowledgement. Taking a shaky breath that filled her lungs with dust, Ida got to her feet. She smoothed her filthy dress, a useless gesture of a life that no longer existed. Then, placing one foot in front of the other, she walked out of the darkness and followed him. She stepped out into the sun. It was a physical blow, a wall of heat and light that made her stagger. The town of Santa was little more than one long, dusty street lined with sun-bleached wooden buildings. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's shop where the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil echoed in the hot, still air, and everywhere. There were eyes, men leaning in doorways, women pausing with their baskets, children stopping their games in the dirt. Every single person on that street had stopped what they were doing to stare. They stared at the big, quiet man in the heavy coat, and they stared at the disheveled, terrified girl trailing in his wake like a shadow. The town was looking, and Ida knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat, that her troubles were only just beginning. The single street of Santa stretched before them, a long tongue of red dirt licking at the foundations of the weary buildings. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the raw timber and warped boardwalks. Jed Holt walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his boots sinking slightly into the deep dust with each step, leaving prints that the wind immediately began to erase. He did not seem to notice the heat, or the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes that had fixed on them the moment they stepped from the train. He moved like a man walking through his own yard, indifferent to the world. Ida followed a few paces behind, the space between them a chasm of uncertainty. For her, the stairs were a physical assault. She felt them like insects crawling on her skin, each glance a judgment, a question, a verdict. She wanted to pull her father's worn traveling cloak tighter around her, but she had left it on the train, and Jed's coat was now her only shield. She walked with her head down, her gaze fixed on the shifting dust. trying to make herself small, to disappear into the blinding glare. The town was a creature of sound and smell. From an open doorway thick with shadows came the rhythmic clang of a hammer striking an anvil, a heartbeat of iron and fire. The air carried the scent of coal smoke, of horse and sun-baked leather, and a faint aroma of frying bacon from a nearby cookhouse. A saloon door swung open, spilling the tinny sound of a piano and a wave of laughter into the street before swinging shut again, cutting the sound off as if with a knife. The silence that had greeted their arrival began to break, fracturing into a low hum of whispers that followed them like a swarm of unseen flies. The words were quiet, meant to be overheard rather than directly heard, each one a small, sharp stone. "Look at her dress," a woman's voice murmured from behind a curtained window. "Too fine for this part of the country, even with the dirt." "Hands are soft," a man grunted, leaning against a support post, whittling a piece of wood. "Never seen a day's real work." Another voice, thin and reedy, rose with certainty. "She has got the look of a preacher's girl, too clean, even under all that dust. Carries herself like she is afraid God himself is watching." The words stripped her bare. They were creating a story for her, a history, an identity, all from a glance. They saw a fallen woman, a stray, a problem. They saw her through the lens of their own hard lives, their own rigid rules of what a woman should be, where she should be. In their eyes, she was not a person fleeing a terrible fate. She was an object out of place, and therefore a threat to the town's fragile order. Jed seemed to hear none of it. He led them to the largest building on the street, a two-story structure with a long porch and a faded sign that read, "Agnes's Rooms, Meals, Saloon." The letters were tilted and weary, as if tired of the sun. He stepped up onto the boardwalk, his boots making a solid, definitive sound on the wood. Ida hesitated for a moment before scurrying up after him, feeling like a mouse darting from the shadow of a hawk. The inside was dim and cooler, the air heavy with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and boiled coffee. A long, polished bar ran the length of one wall. Behind it, a woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun was wiping a glass with a clean cloth. Her face was a roadmap of hard years, her eyes the color of faded denim, and they missed nothing. She watched them approach, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile, merely watchful. She was a gatekeeper, and she had seen every kind of trouble walk through her door. Jed stopped at the bar, placing his hands flat on the wood. "A room," he said. His voice was the same low rumble she had heard in the train car, a sound that took up space without being loud. "For the lady." The woman, Agnes, did not look at Jed. Her sharp eyes were fixed on Ida, taking in the torn hem of her dress, the fear in her eyes, the fine red dust that seemed to cling to her very soul. She got a name. Jed's voice was flat. "She needs a room." Agnes held Ida's gaze for a long moment, an assessment so thorough it felt as if she were looking straight through to her bones. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod, she turned and took a key from a hook on the wall. "Second floor, third door on the right. Window faces the street. $2. In advance." Jed reached into his pocket and pulled out a few worn coins, placing them on the bar. The sound they made was small but final. A transaction completed, a boundary drawn. Agnes scooped up the coins without a word and slid the iron key across the bar. Ida reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the cool metal. "There is a basin and pitcher," Agnes said, her voice dry as dust. "Looks like you could use it. Supper is at 6. Do not be late." She turned her attention back to her glass. "The conversation over?" Ida looked at Jed, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a slight nod toward the staircase. "Go!" She turned and walked toward the stairs, the weight of every eye in the saloon on her back. The key felt heavy in her hand, the price of a sanctuary that felt more like a cage. The room was small, but it was clean. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden table with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single straight-backed chair. The window, as Agnes had said, looked out over the main street. It was the most luxurious place Ida had been in for days, yet it felt utterly empty. She walked to the basin and poured some of the lukewarm water, cupping it in her hands and splashing it on her face. The water turned a muddy red as she washed away the layers of dust and grime. She looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror above the table. A stranger looked back, a girl with wide, haunted eyes and a smudge of dirt on her cheek she had missed. From her window, she could see the entire length of the street. She watched as Jed stepped back out onto the porch of the saloon. He stood there for a moment, a solid, immovable figure. He did not follow her inside. He did not take a room for himself. He was maintaining a distance, a separation that was both a comfort and a source of profound loneliness. A man in dusty denim and worn leather chaps, a cattleman by the look of him, detached himself from a group lounging near the general store and ambled over to Jed. He was older, with a sun-wrinkled face and a mouth full of opinions. Ida could not hear their words through the thick glass, but she could see the cattleman's intent. He was talking, gesturing with his thumb toward the boarding house, toward her window. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and warning. He was giving advice, the kind men give other men about women who appear from nowhere. Ida watched, her heart pounding. She expected Jed to argue, to defend her, to say something. Instead, he did nothing. He stood perfectly still, listening, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The cattleman talked for a long time, his jaw working, his hands emphasizing his points. When he finally finished, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and looked at Jed, waiting for a response. Jed did not give him one. He simply stood in silence. After a moment, his head lifted, and his gaze traveled up the front of the building until it found her window. It was not a look of accusation or pity. It was just a look, a quiet confirmation that he knew she was there, that he was aware of the talk, of the danger. It was the look of a man checking his watch, a guard on his post. Then, he turned his back on the cattleman and walked off the porch. He did not go into the saloon. He walked down the side of the building and disappeared around the back. Panic seized Ida. He was gone. He had paid for her room, placed her in this town of watching eyes, and now he had abandoned her. The room, which had felt like a refuge, now seemed to shrink around her. She was alone, with a key to a door that could not protect her from whispers, or from the men who were surely still looking for her. The sun began to dip below the flat horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The shadows grew long and menacing, and the sounds from the saloon below grew louder, more raucous. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap, listening to every creak of the building, every footstep on the boardwalk outside. Time stretched and warped. Hours might have passed, or only minutes. Just as a genuine, deep-seated fear began to take root, a new sound reached her, a soft, rhythmic scraping from the back of the boarding house. She crept to the window and peered down into the dusty yard behind the building. In the deepening twilight, she saw him, Jed. He was not gone. He was standing by the boarding house's small rear door. He looked up, saw her at the window, and gave a single, deliberate gesture with his head. Come. Her heart leaped with a relief so fierce it almost buckled her knees. She did not question it. She grabbed the key, unlocked her door, and slipped out into the hallway. She moved down the back stairs as quietly as she could, her hand trailing along the rough wall. The back door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped out into the cool evening air. Jed was waiting for her. He did not speak. He simply turned and led her across the yard, away from the main building, toward a large, dilapidated structure that leaned as if weary of standing. It was an old stable, long disused by the look of it. The wood was silvered with age, and the large doors hung slightly crooked on their iron hinges. He pushed one of the heavy doors open. It groaned in protest, the sound loud in the quiet yard. He stepped inside and held the door for her. Ada hesitated for only a second before following him into the cavernous darkness. The air inside was thick with the ghost smells of old hay, horses, and dry leather. It was a comforting, earthy scent. A single lantern sat on a barrel, casting a warm, flickering pool of golden light. In its glow, she saw that the stable was mostly empty, save for a few forgotten tools and piles of old straw. In one of the large, clean-swept stalls, Jed had laid out his bedroll. He had chosen this quiet, private space over a room in the house. He had paid for her safety, for her privacy, for the illusion of respectability in the eyes of the town. But for himself, he had chosen the stables. He had drawn a line not just between them, but between them and the rest of the town. This was not Agnes's boarding house. This was not Santa. This was his territory. He had not just found her a room. He was building a sanctuary, a place where the town's judging eyes could not reach, and he had just invited her in. The new day did not arrive with the gentle blush of dawn, but with the sharp, angled shafts of light that pierced the gaps in the stable walls, striping the hay-strewn floor. Ada woke on a makeshift bed of clean straw, a horse blanket Jed had given her drawn up to her chin. The air was cool and still. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had slept without the shuddering motion of the train, without the fear of a hand on her shoulder in the dark, a deep, dreamless sleep that had smoothed some of the hard lines of terror from her face. Jed was already awake, standing near the wide stable doors, looking out at the waking town. He had a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and the steam rose in a thin, straight line in the cool air. He had not made a sound, yet his presence was as solid and certain as the rising sun. He was a man who took up no more space than he needed, yet filled it completely. Shame, a familiar and unwelcome companion, pricked at her. She was a burden, a charity case. He had paid for her room, provided her with shelter, and protected her from men who would have dragged her back to El Paso like a stray animal. He had asked for nothing in return, and that, in its own way, was the heaviest debt of all. Her father had taught her that nothing in this world was free, that every kindness had a price, every favor an obligation. She sat up, brushing straw from her dress. The simple black fabric was her only possession, save for the few coins she had sewn into its hem, a pathetic treasure that would not last her a week. Pride, what little she had left, demanded she act. She would not be kept. She would not be a helpless creature waiting for the next disaster. She stood and walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the dusty floor. "Mr. Holt," she began, her voice small in the vast, quiet space. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her without fully turning around. His gaze remained on the street outside. "I cannot pay you for the room," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Not with money, but I am not idle. My mother taught me to work. I can mend, I can cook, I can clean." She looked around the old stable, at the piles of discarded leather and the dusty, forgotten corners. "I can earn my place here." Jed took a slow sip of his coffee. He seemed to consider her words, or perhaps the rising sun, for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble. "There is a saddle in the far stall. Stitching is coming loose on the fender." He gestured with his cup. "There is a water to be hauled from the well behind the house. Stalls need mucking." He had not looked at her. He had not questioned her ability. He had simply given her work. It was not an act of charity. It was an acceptance of her offer, a practical transaction. It was, in that moment, the greatest kindness he could have possibly shown her. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. She was no longer just the runaway girl. She was a person with a purpose, however small. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and that was the end of it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, a quiet routine that was as healing as any medicine. Ada found a box of old saddler's tools in a dusty corner, an awl, needles, a spool of waxed thread. The leather was stiff and unfamiliar in her hands, so different from the fine fabric she was used to. But she was a quick study. She worked with a fierce, focused determination. Her small, neat stitches a testament to a lifetime of quiet domestic labor. The work was hard. Her fingers grew sore and calloused. Hauling buckets of water from the well made her back and shoulders ache with a fire she had never known. Mucking out the stalls was dirty, smelly work that would have horrified her mother. But with the ache in her muscles came a sense of grounding. She was tired at the end of the day. A deep, physical exhaustion that left no room for the frantic buzzing of fear. She was earning her keep. She was standing on her own 2 feet. Not as a preacher's daughter, not as Corbin Vance's property, but as Ada. Jed never inspected her work, never offered praise or criticism. He simply provided it. When she finished one task, he would silently indicate another. A broken bridle to be fixed, a pile of wood to be stacked. They rarely spoke, but a silent language grew between them, a language of shared space and mutual respect. One afternoon, as she was sitting on an overturned bucket, working a needle through a thick piece of leather, a small shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a boy standing there, no older than 7 or 8. He was small for his age, with a shock of unruly brown hair and wide, curious eyes. His clothes were patched but clean, and his feet were bare, caked in the red dust of the street. He said nothing, just watched her with an unnerving intensity. Ada, unused to children, felt a flicker of uncertainty. She offered a small, hesitant smile. "Hello." The boy did not smile back. He pointed a small, grubby finger at Jed, who was across the stable, checking the shoes on his horse. "Is he your husband?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it startled a laugh out of her. It was the first time she had laughed in what felt like a lifetime, and the sound was rusty and strange in her own ears. "Goodness, no," she said. The boy's gaze shifted back to her, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Are you his wife, then?" The logic was simple, direct, and utterly unshakable. In the world this boy knew, a man and a woman sharing a space this way meant one thing. The question hung in the air, innocent and yet profound. She should have said no. A firm, unequivocal denial, that would have been the proper, truthful answer. But as she looked from the boy's earnest face to the steady, quiet presence of Jed across the stable, another word came to her lips, unbidden. A whisper of a thought, a flicker of something she dared not name. "Not yet," she said softly. The words were out before she could stop them, and they seemed to hang in the dusty, sunlit air, shimmering with a life of their own. A blush crept up her neck. The boy, satisfied with an answer that made sense to him, gave a solemn nod and wandered off. His curiosity sated. Ada looked down at her work, her heart hammering against her ribs. She glanced up through her lashes to see if Jed had heard. He was still bent over his horse's hoof, his back to her, but there was a change in the line of his shoulders, a subtle shift in his posture that told her he had missed nothing. Later that day, the color of the wind began to change. The sky, which had been a relentless, pale blue, took on a sickly yellow tint. The air grew heavy and still, the usual afternoon breeze dying away to an oppressive silence. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer sounded unnaturally loud and close. A sense of wrongness settled over the town. The horses in the stable grew restless, shifting in their stalls and snorting nervously. Jed came in from the yard, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Storm is coming," he said. It was not a prediction. It was a statement of fact, a bad one. Ada looked out the open doors. The sky to the west was no longer yellow, but a deep, bruised brown. A solid wall of dust was rising from the desert floor, a churning, monstrous thing that was blotting out the sun. The wind began to pick up, not as a breeze, but in sharp, violent gusts that rattled the stable doors and kicked up spirals of dust in the yard. Benji Jed's voice was sharp, cutting through the rising howl of the wind. The small boy, who had been playing near the water trough, looked up, his eyes wide with fear. Inside, now. The boy scrambled into the stable just as the first wave of the storm hit. It came with a roar, a physical blow of wind and sand that slammed the heavy stable doors shut with a deafening crash. The world outside disappeared. The light was snuffed out, plunging them into a sudden, terrifying darkness. The only sound was the shriek of the wind and the relentless, scouring hiss of sand against the wooden walls. It sounded as if the world was being stripped down to the bone. Jed moved through the darkness with a familiar certainty. Finding the lantern and striking a match, the small flame flickered wildly before catching, casting a pool of dancing, desperate light in its glow. Ida could see Benji huddled against a stall, his face pale. The air was already thick with fine dust, making it hard to breathe. "Help me with the door," Jed said, his voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. Together, they dragged a heavy workbench and braced it against the doors. They stuffed old rags and straw into the cracks around the frame, but the fine, insidious dust still found its way through, a constant, gritty rain in the enclosed space. There was nothing more to do. The storm had them. They were trapped in a small bubble of lantern light, an island in a roaring sea of sand. Jed sat on an old crate, his quiet stillness a rock in the storm. Benji, after a few moments, crept over and sat on the floor, leaning against Jed's leg, taking comfort from his solid presence. Ida sat on her overturned bucket, her hands clenched in her lap. The noise was immense, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the very floorboards. It felt as if the stable might be torn apart at any moment. Hours passed. There was no day, no night, only the storm, in the close, suffocating space. Ida's own fears began to rise, swirling like the dust outside. The whispers of the town, which she had tried to ignore, came back to her. Too clean, a preacher's girl. Trouble. She looked at Jed, his face half hidden in shadow, half illuminated by the lantern. He was her protector, but he was a stranger. He knew nothing of her, of the contract, of Corbin Vance. He only knew what he saw. What if the town was right? What if she had brought nothing but trouble to this quiet man's door? The question became a physical ache, a pressure in her chest that she could no longer contain. She had to speak. She had to know. "They say I am too clean," she said, her voice barely a whisper, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Jed's head lifted, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. "They say I am trouble." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Are they right?" He looked at her for a long time, the lantern light catching the hard planes of his face. The wind shrieked, and the stable groaned under the assault. She expected him to say nothing. She expected him to dismiss the question, or to offer some empty platitude. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the storm with an absolute clarity. "I do not listen to them," he said. "I listen to you." The words were simple, 4 simple words, but they landed in the center of her fear and shattered it. He was not listening to the whispers, to the judgments of the town. He was not looking at her as a problem to be solved or a creature to be pitied. He was listening to her voice, her truth. In that moment, in the heart of the storm, he gave her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. A tear she did not know she had been holding back traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. Sometime later, in the deep of the night, the storm began to recede. The constant, deafening roar softened to a mournful howl, then to a low moan, and then, finally, to a profound and ringing silence. The world outside was utterly still. Jed rose and, with Ida's help, moved the heavy workbench away from the doors. He lifted the bar and pushed one of the great doors open a few inches. The air that flowed in was cool and clean, washed fresh and tasting of rain that had fallen somewhere far away. The sky was not black, but a deep, velvety indigo, studded with a breathtaking spray of stars that looked close enough to touch. The moon, full and white, bathed the world in a soft, ethereal light. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of pale sand, which softened all the hard edges of the town, making it look new and peaceful, as if the world had been remade. The storm had passed. A fragile, beautiful peace had settled in its place, but Ida knew, as she stood there breathing in the clean, cold air, that it was only a temporary truce. The sand had settled, but the men who were hunting her were still out there, and the sky, for all its beauty, could not hide them forever. The morning after the sandstorm felt like the first day of creation. A clean, cool wind blew from the east, carrying the scent of distant rain and damp earth. The world was hushed, blanketed in a smooth, pale layer of sand that softened the town's harsh angles and buried its imperfections. The people of Santa emerged from their homes slowly, blinking in the bright, clear light, and began the quiet work of digging out, sweeping the sand from their boardwalks and clearing paths through the newly formed dunes in the street. In the stable, a sense of fragile peace held sway. Ida swept the last of the fine, intrusive dust from the floor, her movements rhythmic and calm. The simple, physical labor was a balm to her soul. She felt a flicker of something she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time, a tentative, delicate hope. She was safe. She was useful. In the quiet presence of Jed Holt, she was, for the first time, simply herself. She was not a daughter, not a debt, not a possession. She was Ida, a woman who could mend a saddle and face a storm. It was this fragile peace that made the arrival of the new rider so jarring. He did not look like the other men who passed through Santa. He was not a dusty cattleman or a weary prospector. He rode a lean, dark horse that moved with an unnerving efficiency, and he sat in the saddle with a straight-backed stillness that was more military than cowboy. He was dressed in dark, well-fitting clothes, clean despite the state of the trail. A single holstered pistol rode high on his hip, its handle worn smooth with practice. His face was narrow and sharp, his eyes a pale, cold gray that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. He was a man who had stripped himself of all that was unnecessary excess movement, excess words, excess emotion. He did not ride to the saloon or the general store. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion in front of the sheriff's empty office, where a long, weathered board served as the town's source of news and official notices. From a leather satchel, he produced a single sheet of paper and a hammer. With 4 decisive taps, he nailed the paper to the center of the board. Then he stepped back, crossed his arms, and waited. He was not a man who shouted his business. He let the paper do the talking for him. It did not take long. The blacksmith, wiping his hands on a rag, was the first to wander over. Then Agnes appeared on the porch of her boarding house, her expression grim. A few men from the saloon, drawn by the sight of the stranger, ambled across the street. Soon, a small crowd had gathered, their murmuring voices a low, anxious buzz that disturbed the morning's clean silence. Ida watched from the shadows of the stable doorway, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She could not read the words on the paper, but she did not need to. She knew, with a soul-deep certainty, that it was for her. Benji, who had been helping her sweep, slipped out and crept closer to the crowd, his small body weaving through the legs of the adults. A man with a booming voice read the notice aloud, his words carrying on the clear air, each one a hammer blow against Ida's fragile peace. Notice of reward for the return of one Ida Marlin, 18 years of age, fled from a binding and legal contract of marriage, said contract held by Mr. Corbin Vance of El Paso. The man paused. and a new wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. The name Corbin Vance was not unknown here. It was a name associated with money and power and a particular kind of ruthless business that honest folk tried to avoid. $50 in gold coin for her safe delivery. Any who harbor the fugitive will be in violation of territorial law. The crowd turned as one, their faces a mixture of suspicion, greed, and a kind of righteous anger, their eyes fixed on the stable, their whispers, once about her clothes and her soft hands, now had a new, harder edge: fugitive, violation, property. The paper had given them a vocabulary for their judgment. It had made their suspicions into law. Jed appeared beside her, moving so silently she did not notice him until he was there. He had been in the back, checking a loose fence post. He looked at the crowd, at the stranger standing impassively by the notice board, and then his gaze met Edda's. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was clutching the broom handle so tightly her knuckles were white. He did not speak. He simply stepped out of the stable and into the sunlight. He walked with his usual unhurried pace, his boots making no sound in the soft sand. He did not walk toward the crowd. He walked to the center of the street and stopped, placing himself directly between the townspeople and the stable. He stood alone, a single, defiant figure in the wide, empty road. The stranger, Kane, detached himself from the wall and moved to face him. He stopped a dozen feet away, his cold gray eyes assessing Jed with a professional, detached curiosity. "That is far enough." "Friend," Kane said, his voice as colorless as his eyes, "my business is with the girl." "The girl has a name," Jed replied, his voice a low, even rumble. Kane gave a small, humorless smile. "So she does. And it is written right here on a legal document." He gestured toward the notice. "She broke a contract. In this territory, a contract is law. The law says she belongs to Mr. Vance." The townspeople murmured their agreement. They were people who lived by their word, by handshakes and signed papers. A contract was a sacred thing, a pillar of the hard, uncertain world they lived in. To break one was to invite chaos. Jed's gaze did not waver. He looked past Kane, at the faces in the crowd. He saw their fear, their certainty, their rigid belief in the black and white letters of the law. He drew a slow breath. "She is not a criminal," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Carrying to every person on that street." He paused, letting the silence settle. "She is the result of a man who has not learned to hear the word no." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. The simple, powerful statement landed with a force that no bullet could have matched. It turned the entire situation on its head. It was not about a broken contract. It was not about property. It was about a human being's right to refuse. The crowd grew quiet. The murmuring stopped. On the faces of the women, a flicker of understanding. On the faces of the men, a dawning confusion. They had never heard the world described that way before. Kane's cold smile did not falter, but a new light entered his eyes. A flicker of respect. He had expected a gunfight, a brawl, a shouting match. He had not expected a sermon. He was a professional. He understood tactics, and he understood that, in this moment, he had lost the crowd. To force the issue now would be messy, unpredictable. It would not be efficient. "The law is patient," Kane said quietly. Speaking only to Jed now, "Mr. Vance will have what is his." He gave a curt, formal nod, turned without another word, and walked back to his horse. He swung into the saddle, cast one last, long look at the stable, and then rode out of town the same way he had come, his back straight, his purpose unwavering. He did not look back. The crowd dispersed slowly, uncertainly, breaking off into small groups, their voices now low and questioning. The crisis had passed, but the tension remained, a low hum in the air. Back in the stable, the air was thick with unspoken words. Ida stood where Jed had left her, the broom forgotten in her hands. He had stood for her. He had spoken for her. He had faced down the law and the entire town for her. She owed him the truth, all of it. Jed walked to the large water barrel that stood in the corner, the one she filled every morning. He dipped a ladle into the cool, dark water. "My father," Ida began, her voice trembling but clear. "He is a preacher, a good man, I think, but a weak one. He made bad investments. He fell into debt." She took a ragged breath. A deep debt to Mr. Vance. Jed did not turn. He listened, his back to her. "Mr. Vance came to our home. He did not want money. He said the debt could be erased. He wanted a wife, a young wife, a respectable wife, a preacher's daughter." The shame was a hot coal in her throat, but she forced the words out. "My father agreed. He signed a paper, a contract. They told me it was God's will, that it was my duty to save our family." She could see the wedding day in her mind, the cold church, the scent of wilting flowers, the look in Corbin Vance's eyes. A look of ownership. "I tried to say no." She whispered. "I told my father I could not do it. He told me it was too late. The paper was signed. He said a woman's feelings could not be allowed to stand in the way of a man's honor." She had run that night, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate prayer. She had been running ever since. When she finished, a profound silence filled the stable. The story was told. Her shame was laid bare in the dusty air between them. She waited for his judgment, for his disgust, for him to tell her to leave. Jed turned from the water barrel. In his hand, he held a simple tin dipper, brimming with clean, cool water. He walked to her and held it out. His eyes were not filled with pity or judgment. They were just steady. She looked from his face to the water. Her throat was parched. Her lips cracked. She had been living in a desert of fear and shame for so long. She had forgotten what it felt like to drink. Her hands shook as she took the dipper from him. The metal was cool against her skin. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The water was a shock, so pure and cold it made her gasp. It was more than just water. It was a gesture of simple, profound humanity. It was not a promise of protection. It was not a vow of affection. It was a drink of water for a thirsty soul. It was a quiet statement that said, "I have heard you. I see you. You are a person, not a contract." She drank it all, then lowered the empty dipper, her gaze meeting his over the rim. "Thank you," she said, and the words encompassed everything. He took the dipper from her and returned it to the barrel. The temporary peace had been won. The town was quiet, but as the sun began to set, casting long, deep shadows across the sand-filled street, Ada knew that Cain was still out there. The law was patient, and the darkness, she knew, was his friend. The night in the stable was a world of its own, walled off from the town by old, thick timbers. It was a space defined by the soft rustle of straw, the gentle snuffling of Jed's horse in its stall, and the low, even rhythm of breathing. Benji slept soundly in a nest of hay, one small hand clutching a crudely carved wooden horse. Ada lay on her own pallet, listening to the vast, star-filled silence of the desert. A fragile sense of peace had settled deep in her bones, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost frightening. She had begun to believe they were forgotten, a small island of quiet that the world had passed by. It was the horse that gave the first warning, a low, nervous whicker, followed by the sharp stamp of a hoof on the hard-packed earth. Ida's eyes snapped open in the darkness. She saw Jed's silhouette rise from his bedroll in a single, silent motion, already awake, already listening. The silence that followed was different now. It was not empty, it was filled with a waiting, predatory stillness. Then came the sound, the faint, stealthy scrape of a boot on the dry ground just outside the stable's small side door. A furtive click, like a latch being carefully lifted. Jed moved without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He picked up a heavy iron pry bar that leaned against a post. its weight seeming to disappear in his large hand. He motioned for Ida to stay down, his gesture sharp and absolute in the gloom. He positioned himself to the side of the door, his body coiled, ready. The door creaked open, a sliver of pale moonlight slicing into the darkness. A man slipped through, a hulking shape Ida recognized instantly as Cletus. He was followed by the leaner forms of Silas and Bart. They moved with a clumsy confidence, thinking their prey was asleep and helpless. They had come not with the authority of the law, but with the quiet, nasty purpose of thieves in the night. Bart took a step forward, a length of rope in his hand, and Jed struck. He did not waste time with threats or warnings. He moved with a brutal, contained efficiency. The pry bar swung in a short, vicious arc, connecting with Bart's wrist with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as Jed's fist followed, landing squarely on his jaw. Bart crumpled to the ground in a heap, unconscious before he hit the straw. Silas, startled, drew a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. He lunged, but he was clumsy with surprise. Jed sidestepped the wild slash, grabbed Silas's arm, and used the man's own momentum to slam him face first into a thick wooden support beam. The sound was a dull, wet thud. Silas slid to the floor, limp as a sack of grain. It had taken less than 5 seconds. 2 men down, without a gunshot, without a wasted motion. But Cletus was the most cunning of the 3. As Jed turned from the second man, Cletus, who had hung back near the door, lunged forward. He was not aiming for a fight. He swung the heavy stock of his rifle like a club. Jed tried to turn into the blow, to deflect it, but he was off balance. The dark wood connected with the side of his head, just above the temple. The sound was horrifying, a hollow crack that seemed to suck all the air from the stable. Jed grunted, a deep, pained sound, and his entire body went rigid. For a terrible second, he stood frozen, and then his knees gave way. He collapsed, not with a crash, but with a heavy, final settling into the straw. His face turned toward the darkness. For Ida, the world stopped. The sight of Jed, the immovable man, the silent mountain of strength, falling to the ground, shattered her universe. A cold, paralyzing terror seized her, rooting her to her palate. Cletus stood over Jed's still form, breathing heavily, a cruel grin spreading across his face in the dim light. "Not so tough now, are you?" he panted. His gaze swept the stable and landed on Ida, a new, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Now, little church mouse, you are coming with me. Mr. Vance is tired of waiting." He took a step toward her, and it was then that Benji, woken by the sounds of the fight, sat up in his nest of hay, his small face a pale oval of confusion and fear. "Jed," he whimpered. Cletus's attention snapped to the boy. His grin widened. "Well now, look what we have here, a little insurance." He moved quickly, crossing to Benji and grabbing the boy by the front of his small shirt, hauling him to his feet. Benji cried out, a small, terrified sound. "You make a move, girl, and the boy gets hurt. Understand?" Something inside Ida broke. It was not a gentle fracturing. It was a violent, seismic snap. The paralyzing fear did not disappear, but it was consumed by something else, something ancient and ferocious and utterly new to her. A white, hot rage. The sight of that man's hand on that small, helpless boy was an offense against God and nature, and it burned away every last trace of the frightened preacher's daughter she had been. She moved. Her limbs felt strange, disconnected, but they obeyed. Propped against the wall, not 10 feet from her, was an old shotgun Jed kept for hunting fowl. She scrambled across the floor, and her hands closed around the cool, smooth wood of the stock and the cold, solid steel of the barrels. It was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined, an unwieldy and terrible weight. She rose to her feet, leveraging the gun up. It wavered in her trembling arms, but she found her footing. planting her feet in the straw. She did not know how to aim. She did not know if it was even loaded. It did not matter. She pointed the twin black barrels directly at Cletus's chest. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. It was a low, steady sound, stripped of all emotion save for a cold, deadly certainty. It was the voice of a woman pushed past her breaking point. "Touch him," she said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence of the stable, "and I will bury you right here." Cletus froze, his hand still gripping Benji's shirt. He looked from the twin muzzles of the shotgun to Ida's face. He saw no fear there now, no tears, no pleading. He saw something he had not expected, something as hard and unyielding as the land itself. He saw a line that he had crossed, and he saw the absolute conviction in her eyes that she would end him if he did not step back. He let go of Benji's shirt as if it were a hot coal. The boy scrambled away, running to hide behind a water barrel, his small sobs the only sound in the charged air. "Now get out," Ida said, her voice still dangerously calm. "Get your filth out of this stable and do not ever come back." Cletus stared at her for a moment longer, his bravado gone, replaced by a sullen, wary anger. He glanced at his two unconscious companions. He could not fight her and carry them both. He had lost. He backed away slowly, his hands held up in a placating gesture. He dragged Silas and Bart out of the stable one by one, their bodies limp and awkward. Then, with one last hateful glare at Ida, he disappeared into the night. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by Benji's muffled crying and the ragged sound of Ida's own breathing. The heavy shotgun slipped from her numb fingers, thudding into the soft straw. She ran to Jed. His wound was a dark, ugly gash on the side of his head, already swelling, the blood matting his dark hair. She pressed a piece of clean cloth to it, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The next few days blurred into a long, desperate vigil, with Agnes's quiet, unquestioning help. She cleaned the wound and stitched it closed with a fine needle and thread, her hands moving with a surgeon's focus born of sheer terror. Jed was consumed by a fever. He tossed and turned, muttering words she could not understand, lost in a world of his own making. She sat by his side day and night, bathing his face with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips, changing the bandages on his head. Benji was her silent shadow, his fear replaced by a solemn sense of purpose. He brought her water. He sat quietly and watched, and one afternoon, he presented her with a piece of smoothed planking on which he had drawn 3 stick figures in charcoal, a tall man, a woman in a long dress, and a small boy standing between them, all holding hands. He had drawn a square around them, a house. On the 3rd day, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, Jed's feverish thrashing finally ceased. He lay still, his breathing deep and even. His eyes opened. They were no longer glazed with fever, but clear and lucid. He looked at her, his gaze steady. He was weak, but he was himself again. He tried to sit up, and she gently pushed him back down. "You need to rest," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and relief. "Here," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Need some air." She helped him to his feet, his arm draped over her shoulders, his weight a heavy, solid reassurance. They shuffled slowly to the large, open doors of the stable and stood there, breathing in the cool evening air. The town was quiet, settling in for the night. The light was soft and forgiving. From the street, the low murmur of voices reached them. 2 women, walking home from the general store, their heads close together in gossip. One of them gestured vaguely toward the stable. They said she'd never been kissed. Wild and trouble. The woman's voice trailed off as she noticed the 2 figures standing in the doorway, and she hurried on, her face flushed with embarrassment. Ida flinched, the words a familiar sting. But Jed did not seem to hear the malice in them. A faint, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. He turned away from the street and looked at the stable, at the open doorway that had become their sanctuary. He took a steadying breath, then took a step back, disengaging his arm from her shoulder. He stood before the entrance, on the dusty ground just outside the threshold. Then he lifted his hand and knocked. It was not a loud knock, just a single, soft, deliberate rap of his knuckles against the weathered wood. He looked at her, his eyes asking a question his lips did not form. He was waiting for her permission. After all that had happened, after he had fought for her and bled for her, he was still asking permission to enter her world. He knocked anyway. Tears welled in Ida's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, and stepped back, holding the door open for him. He walked inside, into the familiar scent of dry hay and horse and home. He was not storming in. He was not taking. He was accepting her invitation. A few nights later, his fever broke for good. He woke in the middle of the night, his skin cool to the touch. He was weak, but his mind was clear. She was sitting by his side, dozing in a chair, when his hand found hers in the darkness. His grip was surprisingly strong. She woke with a start, her heart leaping before she realized where she was. His eyes were open, watching her in the moonlight that streamed through the door. "Are you still here?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. She squeezed his hand, her fingers lacing through his. The answer was the truest thing she had ever said in her life. "I am not going anywhere," she said softly, "unless you send me away." He was silent for a long moment, and then his thumb gently stroked the back of her hand. He did not send her away. He held her hand tighter, and in the quiet darkness of the stable, surrounded by the ghosts of violence and the promise of dawn, they fell asleep. The days that followed the attack were quiet, steeped in a slow, healing calm. Jed's strength returned in small increments. First, he was able to sit up on his own, then to stand, and then to take a few slow, deliberate steps around the stable. The gash on his head began to heal, leaving a raw, red scar that he would carry for the rest of his days. He said little about the fight, and Ida did not ask. The violence of that night was a shared and terrible secret, a dark river they had crossed together. To speak of it would be to disturb its murky depths. Instead, they focused on the small, quiet rituals of recovery. Life, which had been suspended in the amber of fear and fever, began to move forward again. The first sign of this return to normalcy came from Benji. One morning, he appeared at the stable door, his face alight with a secret, solemn joy. He held out his cupped hands and nestled inside. On a bed of soft grass were 3 small, perfectly formed brown eggs. "Agnes's hen," he whispered, as if revealing a great treasure. "She made a nest under the porch steps. They are a secret." Ida looked at the eggs, so smooth and warm and full of life, and a feeling of profound gratitude washed over her. It was more than just food. It was a gift. It was a sign that the world was still turning, that life was still stubbornly, miraculously, pushing its way forward. She fried the eggs in a small skillet over a low fire, and the 3 of them, the quiet, healing man, the watchful woman, and the small, hopeful boy, shared the simple meal in a comfortable silence. It was a feast. It was a communion. With Jed steadily recovering, Ida found her own world expanding. She no longer felt like a prisoner in the stable. She began to take short walks in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the heat had begun to bleed from the day. She kept to the edges of the town, avoiding the main street and the lingering, curious glances of the townspeople. She discovered a small, neglected graveyard on a low hill and a dry creek bed lined with smooth, gray stones. Her favorite walk was along a stretch of old, dilapidated fence line that marked the western edge of the town's common grazing land. The posts were weathered and gray, leaning at odd angles. The wire between them rusted and broken. It was a place of quiet decay, a forgotten boundary. But here, in this place of endings, she found a beginning. Pushing up through the hard, dry soil at the base of the fence posts were small, stubborn clusters of yellow wildflowers. They were not grand or beautiful flowers. They were small and tough, with tiny, bright petals that seemed to defy the harshness of the land. They were survivors. They had found a way to bloom in a place where nothing else grew. One evening, Jed was well enough to walk with her. He was still slower than usual, his movements careful, but the familiar, solid strength was returning to his frame. They walked in their usual comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The sun was setting, a great fiery smear of orange and red across the horizon, and a cool breeze stirred the dry grass. They stopped at the old fence line. Anita reached out to touch one of the small, bright yellow blossoms. She ran her finger over the delicate, resilient petals. "I used to think that a woman's life was like a garden," she said softly, her voice almost carried away by the wind, something to be carefully tended, protected from the weeds and the harsh sun. "My father taught me that a woman's purity was her most precious flower, something to be guarded and given away, whole and untouched, to her husband on her wedding day." She looked at Jed, his profile stark and strong against the dying light. "I have spent my whole life being told what I was worth, that my value was in being clean, obedient, untouched, that I was a treasure to be passed from my father's hand to another man's. When I ran, I was not just running from Corbin Vance, I was running from that garden, from those walls." She turned her gaze back to the flower. "But this is different." She gestured to the small, tough blossoms. "This is not a garden. This is just life. It is not clean. It is dusty, and it has to fight for every drop of water. But it is strong. It blooms where it can, because it wants to." She took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. The words she had held in her heart for so long finally rose to the surface, clear and certain. "I no longer wish to be a flower in a garden. I only want to give myself to the one who stayed." Her voice was a whisper, but it was filled with the strength of a lifetime of unspoken truth. To the one who saw the storm and did not run. Jed was silent for a long time. He looked from her face, so earnest and open in the twilight, to the small yellow flowers clinging to the fence post. He reached out and, with a surprising gentleness, his large, calloused fingers brushed a strand of hair from her cheek that the wind had loosened. "It is not because you are clean," he said, his voice low and rough, "and it is not because you belong to me." He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It is because you chose. That is all that has ever mattered." His words were a key, unlocking the last bolted door in her heart. He was not her savior. He was not her owner. He was the man who saw her, not as a prize to be won or a soul to be saved, but as a person with the right to choose. He had given her a gift more precious than protection, more valuable than any treasure. He had given her back her own will. The space between them, which had always been charged with unspoken things, now became something else. It was no longer a space of fear or gratitude or uncertainty. It was a space of quiet, mutual understanding. He leaned down, slowly, giving her every opportunity to turn away, to refuse. She did not move. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, and lifted her face to his. His lips were not soft or demanding. They were firm and dry from the desert sun, and they met hers with a gentle, questioning pressure. It was not a kiss of passion, of fire and conquest. It was a kiss of quiet certainty, of profound and solemn agreement. It was the sealing of a contract that had no need for paper or ink, a promise made in the language of shared survival and deep, unspoken respect. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the fading purple light, the cool whisper of the wind, and the solid, reassuring presence of him. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, An entire world shifted on its axis. When he drew back, they did not speak. There were no words for what had just passed between them. Words were too small, too clumsy. He simply took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and they stood for a long time, watching the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They walked back to the stable in an easy silence, their hands linked, a small, warm connection in the vast, cool darkness. The town was asleep. The only light was the pale wash of the moon and the distant, friendly glow of their own lantern in the stable doorway. It was a beacon, a small, steady light in the immense darkness of the desert. He did not let go of her hand when they reached the stable. He did not let it go as they stepped over the threshold, into the familiar, comforting scent of hay and home. He simply held on, a silent promise that he was not going anywhere. And in the quiet warmth of the stable, with the moon standing sentinel outside, Ida knew, with a certainty that filled every part of her, that she had finally, truly, come home. The quiet that had settled over Santa was not one of peace, but of anticipation. The town was holding its breath. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silent, watchful waiting. The people had seen a man stand for a principle, and they had seen a woman begin to stand for herself. The story of Jed and Ida was no longer a piece of idle gossip. It had become a public ledger, and the town was waiting to see how the final accounts would be settled. They did not have to wait long. 3 days after Jed and Ida had walked back from the old fence line, their hands entwined, Cain returned. He rode into town at high noon, when the sun was a white, merciless eye in the sky. He was not alone this time. Flanking him were 2 hard-faced men wearing the tarnished badges of territorial deputies. They were not lawmen in the service of justice, but hired guns given the thin veneer of authority. They were Cain's muscle, his legal right made manifest in leather and steel. Their arrival brought the town to a standstill. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Agnes appeared on the porch of her boarding house, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of grim resolve. The cattleman who had once warned Jed about Ida now leaned against a post, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but attentive. Men drifted out of the saloon, not with the boisterous energy of drinkers, but with the quiet purpose of witnesses. They formed a loose, silent semicircle in the dusty street. There were no whispers now. There was only the heavy, oppressive weight of their collective gaze. This was a trial, and the whole town had been called to serve as its jury. Cain and his men dismounted, their movements precise and economical. Cain held a leather portfolio in his hand. He did not post a notice this time. He walked to the center of the street, the place where Jed had stood before, and waited. He had come to collect. Jed emerged from the stable. He moved with his old, steady grace, the last traces of his injury gone. He wore no gun belt. His hands were empty, at his sides. He walked to the center of the street and stopped a dozen feet from Cain, the sun beating down on his bare head. "Halt," Cain said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I am here to execute a legal contract. I have 2 deputized officers of the territory with me. We will take the girl. You can either step aside, or you can be arrested for interfering with the law." "What you call the law is just a piece of paper," Jed replied, his voice calm and even, yet carrying to every corner of the silent street. Cain opened his portfolio and produced the contract, its ink dark and official against the white page. "This piece of paper is what separates us from the animals. Halt, it is the foundation of order." She agreed. Her father agreed. "It is done." "A piece of paper cannot own a person," Jed said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the watching townspeople before returning to Cain. "And a contract cannot silence the word no from a human soul. You know this. Every man and woman here knows this." He was not arguing the fine points of the law. He was appealing to a higher court, to the innate sense of right and wrong that existed in the hearts of the people watching. He was putting not just Ida, but the very definition of freedom on trial. A flicker of annoyance crossed Kane's face. This was not going as planned. He had expected a gunfight, a simple matter of force. He was being drawn into a debate about morality, and it was a battlefield he was not equipped to win on. "I am not here to debate philosophy," Kane snapped, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I am here to enforce a legal writ. My men have their instructions. Stand aside. This is your final warning." The two deputies shifted their weight, their hands moving to rest on the handles of their pistols. The silent tension in the street ratcheted up, becoming a tangible, vibrating thing. The moment was balancing on the edge of a knife. It was then that Ida stepped out of the stable. She did not hesitate in the shadows. She walked directly into the blinding sunlight, her head held high, her back straight. She did not stop behind Jed. She walked to his side, so close that their shoulders were almost touching. She was no longer a creature to be sheltered. She was a partner in this fight. She looked directly at Kane, her eyes clear and unwavering. The fear was still there. A cold knot deep inside her, but it no longer controlled her. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was filled with a resonant, unshakable calm that carried even further than Jed's. "I do not consent," she said. The three simple words were a declaration of independence, a statement of sovereignty over her own life. "My father signed that paper. I did not. You can call it a contract. You can call it the law. But if you take me from this place against my will, you are not an officer of the law. You are a kidnapper. And that is a crime against a power higher than any territorial court." Kane stared at her, a look of genuine surprise on his narrow face. He had come for a frightened girl, a runaway piece of property. He was facing a woman who was calmly and logically dismantling his entire legal justification. The townspeople were shifting, murmuring among themselves. The ground was sliding out from under him. Violence was his only remaining option. "I have had enough of this," he snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. "Take her!" As the deputies tensed, ready to move, a small commotion occurred at the edge of the crowd. Benji, who had been hiding behind a rain barrel, clutching the wooden family plaque he had made, had been inching forward, trying to get closer to Jed and Ida. In his anxiety, he stumbled over a loose board. The plaque flew from his hands, and he fell, knocking over a crate of old ironmongery and discarded tools that the blacksmith had left by the side of the road. The contents of the crate spilled into the dust with a loud, metallic clatter. A rusty horseshoe, a broken hinge, a bent file, and something else, a long, wicked-looking knife with a distinctive handle carved in the shape of a coiled snake. It landed in the dirt, and as it fell, a few dark, reddish flakes chipped off the blade. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Thomas, took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the knife. "Well, I will be," he said, his deep voice rumbling. "That is Silas Croft's knife. I made that handle for him myself 2 years back. Wonder what it is doing in my scrap pile." A dead silence fell over the street. Everyone in the territory knew of Silas Croft and his companions. Cletus and Bart, they were hired thugs, back alley brutes who did the dirty work for powerful men. They were not officers of the law. They were criminals. Agnes stepped forward, her arms crossed, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "I know what it is doing there," she said, her voice sharp and clear. She pointed a finger at Kane. "It is here because you sent those animals to do your work in the dead of night. You sent them to attack a man in his sleep and to terrorize a woman and a child. That is the kind of law you represent, Kane. The law of the coward and the bully." The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. The town had its evidence. Kane had not come with the clean hands of the law. His claim was tainted by the blood and grime of a criminal assault. The jury had reached its verdict. The cattleman, who had been leaning against the post, straightened up and spat a long stream of tobacco juice into the dust at Kane's feet. The blacksmith took a slow, deliberate step forward, his massive hands clenched into fists. Other men in the crowd began to move, their expressions hard and unforgiving. The social contract of the town was reasserting itself, and it had no room for a man like Kane. Kane was a professional. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. To draw his gun now would be suicide. He had lost his legal authority, he had lost his moral high ground, and he had lost the town. He slowly raised his hands, a gesture of concession, not surrender. "This is not over," he said, his voice a low, venomous hiss directed at Jed and Ida. He backed away slowly, his deputies following his lead. "The paper is still valid. Mr. Vance does not forget. He does not forgive." He mounted his horse, his movement stiff with controlled rage. He will come for what is his. He gave one last, cold look at the two of them standing together in the center of the street, then wheeled his horse around and, with his deputies, rode out of town, leaving a trail of dust and unanswered threats behind him. The tension in the street broke. The crowd began to disperse, but not before many of them, the blacksmith, the cattleman. Even Agnes gave Jed and Ida a slow, deliberate nod of respect. They had not just won a fight, they had won their place. In the sudden quiet, with the dust settling around them, Jed turned to Ida. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the shadow that had followed him from the train, but the woman of substance and strength who had stood beside him and faced down the world. The sun was hot on their faces, and the future was a vast, unknown territory, but they would not face it alone. "From now on," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, "we say us." Ida met his gaze, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. The first she had truly felt in a lifetime. She did not need to speak. She just nodded, and in that simple gesture, a new contract was signed, a new law was written, and a new life began. The shadow of Corbin Vance did not lift overnight. It lingered like the heat that shimmered off the noon street. A threat spoken in a whisper, a promise of a future reckoning. But fear, Ida discovered, is a fire that needs fuel, and in the steady, quiet rhythm of the days that followed, there was no fuel to be found. There was only work and purpose and the slow, steady building of a life. The town, having chosen its side, seemed to open its arms to them in its own gruff, undemonstrative way. Jed's reputation as a man who did not seek trouble but could end it decisively earned him a quiet respect. Thomas, the blacksmith, offered him work. Jed's hands, already skilled with rope and wood, proved equally adept with iron and fire. The ring of his hammer striking the anvil became a new, steady heartbeat in the town, a sound of creation and repair. He mended broken wagon wheels, forged new hinges for sagging gates, and shod the horses of the cattlemen who now met his gaze with a level nod. He was no longer a stranger. He was a fixture, a part of the town's solid, working core. Ida, too, found her place. Her initial arrangement with Agnes blossomed into a genuine partnership. The kitchen of the boarding house, once a place of intimidating smells and sounds, became her domain. She baked bread, its warm, yeasty scent a welcome counterpoint to the street's dust and grit. She made pies that reminded the hard men of the town of mothers and homes they had long since left behind. Her needle, once a tool for quiet, decorative embroidery, now became a source of income. She mended torn shirts and patched denim trousers, her small, neat stitches a mark of quality that the women of the town came to value. She was no longer the preacher's daughter or the runaway fugitive. She was Ida, the woman who baked with a light hand and mended with a strong thread. And then there was Benji. He was no longer a stray, a small shadow flitting at the edges of their lives. He was the center. He became their son in every way that mattered. He spent his days divided between the forge, where he would watch Jed with a silent, hero-worshipping awe, and the kitchen, where he would be the first to taste Ida's latest creation. In the evenings, the three of them would sit in the transformed stable, which was slowly but surely becoming a home. Jed taught the boy how to carve a whistle from a piece of river wood. Ida taught him his letters, drawing them in the dust on the floor. He was a quiet, solemn child. but in the newfound safety of their small, unlikely family. A rare, bright smile would sometimes light up his face, a smile that was more precious than any gold. One evening, after they had finished their simple supper, Jed rose from the table. He picked up a hammer and a single, clean nail. He walked to the main wall of their living space, the wall that faced the door. He looked at Ida, a silent question in his eyes. She knew instantly what he intended. She went to the small shelf where she kept their few treasures and picked up the piece of planking on which Benji had drawn his charcoal family. The lines were crude, the figures simple sticks, but the meaning was as clear and true as scripture. She handed the drawing to Jed. He held it against the wall, positioning it carefully in the center. He placed the tip of the nail just above it. He struck the nail twice with the hammer. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp and definitive. An echo of the blacksmith's forge, a sound of something being made permanent. It was the sound of a root taking hold in hard ground. He hung the drawing, and the three of them stood back and looked at it, the three stick figures, holding hands inside their protective square, a home, in the corner of the stable. They had built a small stone hearth, and a low, cheerful fire crackled within it, its warmth pushing back the cool desert night, its gentle sound a quiet replacement for the memory of the howling storm. The final piece of the past fell away on a Tuesday. With the arrival of the weekly stagecoach, the driver, a garrulous man with a dusty beard, handed Agnes a small, sealed envelope along with the usual mail. It was addressed in a shaky, unfamiliar hand, with no name, only a description for the woman in Santa who defied Corbin Vance. Agnes brought the letter to Ida in the kitchen, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Ida's hands trembled as she took it. The specter of Vance, which had receded to a dull ache, now returned with a sharp, cold pang. She broke the seal with her thumb and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was short, the handwriting hurried and anonymous. It spoke of trouble in El Paso, of federal marshals asking questions about certain shipping contracts and land deeds, of powerful men, once Vance's allies, now keeping their distance. The letter did not speak of justice in grand terms. It spoke of finances and logistics and frightened partners. It ended with a single, stark sentence: the Vance empire is cracking, and the man himself is too busy plugging the holes in his own dam to worry about a single drop of water that has escaped. Ada read the letter twice, then a third time. She walked out of the kitchen and across the yard to the blacksmith's shop. The paper clutched in her hand. The clang of the hammer stopped as she approached. She handed the letter to Jed. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. He did not speak. He did not need to. A great, unseen weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The threat was not gone, but it had been diminished, reduced from a monstrous certainty to a distant, fading possibility. The larger world, with its slow, grinding, and often invisible wheels of justice, had finally begun to turn in their favor. A few days later, they rode through the town together. Jed had bought a gentle mare with the money he had earned, and Ida rode it with a natural, easy grace. They rode side by side down the center of the main street, not with defiance, but with the quiet confidence of people who belonged. The cattleman, lounging on the saloon porch, lifted his hat to her. Thomas, the blacksmith, paused in his work to give them a wide, approving grin. Agnes stood on her porch and watched them pass, a rare, soft smile on her face. The town had seen their trial by fire, and it had given them its final, silent verdict. They were no longer the stranger and the runaway. They were Jed and Ida. They were home. That night, a gentle peace settled over the stable, as soft and profound as the moonlight that silvered the roof. Jed and Benji were inside, the boy already half asleep by the warm hearth. Ada had stepped out to fetch a final bucket of water from the well, the night air cool and clean on her face. The stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet. She stood for a moment, just breathing, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet, the vast, quiet sky above her. She felt a sense of belonging so deep it was a physical ache in her chest. She walked back to the stable, carrying the water. The door was ajar, a warm, golden rectangle of light spilling out into the darkness. She could hear the soft crackle of the fire, the low murmur of Jed's voice as he told Benji a story. She stopped at the threshold, her hand resting on the weathered wood of the doorframe. She could have just walked in. It was her home. But some moments required a ceremony, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come. She lifted her hand and gave a soft, familiar knock on the door, a gentle rap of her knuckles on the wood. Jed's voice stopped. He looked up, his face illuminated by the firelight. He smiled. Ada smiled back, a smile that came from the deepest, truest part of her soul. She looked at him, at the home they had built, at the future that stretched before them, a road opening up into the vast, promising country of their lives together. "I choose," she said softly. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.